Before we continue with the video, if you like what I'm doing here on this channel, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel a lot. Anyway, let's get back to the video. Welcome. In this tutorial, we will be talking about Enhanced Input plugin, a plugin provided by Epic to continue the evolution of inputs in Unreal Engine. This system is currently in beta as of the time of the recording, when I'm using Unreal Engine version 5.03, and functions may have changed slightly in between now and when you are watching this. But what we are essentially going to be doing today is we're going to be going through how to set up enhanced inputs in Unreal Engine. We're going to be showing the different components. We are going to be talking a little bit how it's working, and we're going to be demonstrating a few use cases as well in the end. So that's essentially what we will be doing in this video. Starting off, let's jump into our plugin section. Typing input here will allow us to find this plugin. It's called Enhanced Input, and this plugin here we want to add to our project. So click yes, and then restart the engine. After we have restarted the engine, we need to do one configuration in our project settings. So going there and going to input, we have a default classes section here. We need to change player input to be enhanced player input, and we need to change input component to be enhanced input component. That is all we need from the configuration side. And now in this project, we have everything set up for starting to make use of enhanced inputs. To make this as understandable as possible, I'm going to be referencing and comparing it to the old normal inputs so that you get sort of a sense of how things are working. So in our project settings, we're going to be staying in our input section over here, and we will be expanding our axis mappings and action mappings and axis mappings. So if you're familiar with this, action mappings are essentially one-off events. So you click on a button and you start jumping. Axis mappings are things like moving in along a certain axis, and then it has scales on it so that you use W for moving forward, but S for also moving forward. You just multiply by -1 to have it move backwards instead. And that's essentially how it works. And then you can also add the gamepad keybinds and such if you want as well. So let's start with the first component that we have available. Now let's create a folder so we have it structured. We call it Enhanced Inputs. When we right click now in our content browser, we have a new line here called Input, which allows us to create input actions, input mapping context, and player bindable input configs. We will start with an input action. Possibly a good naming convention for this could be IA for input action, and then we can say that this is supposed to be our move forward. You could name it move forward or move forward backwards, so you know that all of the different commands that are available in this, it's a little bit up to you. But essentially now, an input action corresponds to which section it's supposed to be here. So if it's an action mapping or an axis mapping. How this is configured is if you go into the input action itself, let's put it up here and let's change our editor settings to open everything like that in the main window. Anyway, so here you have the settings that actually define what the input action is. So digital bool here, for example, means that it will have a true or a false value, meaning pressed or not pressed. So this would be essentially the same as an action mapping then currently. You can change this to be an axis 1D. This gives us a float value, which essentially makes it an axis mapping here, like moving forward and backward. That's along one axis. You can also enhance this further and make it a different type. And to make this obvious, let's open up our blueprint character. Actually, it's probably in here. So if we were to right click now and type in IA and then move forward, you can see that it appears as an event available here now. So currently we have this being an axis mapping of float type, meaning a normal axis mapping, and that's what we get as our action value out here. So this here is a float value that will be between +1 and -1 depending on if we're moving forward or backward. If we instead had this set to be a vector 2D, what we're getting in our blueprint now is instead a two-dimensional vector. So we get an X and a Y value if you wanted to have some advanced logic for the movement or the input action. And you can also have a 3 vector if you wanted to, which turns this into an actual vector over here. So you have a X, Y, and Z. So that is how an input action works or corresponds. The value type will determine if it is an action or axis mapping. In this case, we want an axis mapping. And the type of value table there also determines what kind of an action value you get out from the event that you're hooking on here. So let's say we wanted to replace our existing moving forward. So let's find where that is. We have move forward here, move input, backward, forward. We'll just copy this and unhook this so it doesn't work and put it over here. So this will be our functionality. You can see that we have 4 different events here, and I'm going to be demonstrating how those work now. So here you can see that for each of the different events, I have added a print string now that corresponds to the type of event that is being triggered. The issue we have currently is that this enhancement input action is currently not being used by us, because even though we have the event here, it doesn't know how to use it. We need to actually first tell this character or our player controller, we can do it from there as well, that we're going to be making use of this input action. How this is done is we can go to a begin play, for example, and we can get our controller, and we can cast this controller to a player controller. The reason we're casting it to a player controller is because we need to have a player controller to make use of the enhanced input. And we'll promote this to a variable, and we'll leave it as player controller. That's fine. From this now, we can get our input enhanced input local player subsystem. Now this object here is what allows us to make use of mappings and a few other functionalities as well. So with this one we can say add and mapping, and we get to add a mapping context. Now we haven't gone through what a mapping context is yet, so let's do that. So a mapping context, if we go back to our enhanced input, we go to input and we create an input mapping context. We can call it IMC and then say standard. So this will represent our normal movement functionality essentially. Opening this up, we can see that we have not much in here currently, but we can add mappings here. Adding a mapping makes it a little bit more clear how this works, because now we get this drop down here where we can add an input action. So adding our move forward, for example, we're essentially saying that this context allows for this input action to be registered. So how you can view the input mapping, the mapping context is essentially like saying which are the keys that should be reacting to the input action. And the input action itself is essentially saying if it's an action mapping or an axis mapping. So that's how the two are differentiated, which means that if we go back to our context and we say we want to move forward, we can now define that we want to have the W key for it to move forward, for example. And we can add another one if we want to have this to move backward as well. So we'll get the keyboard for S. And now we have essentially created the same thing as we have over here when it comes to the moving forward and backward, for the keyboard at least. Now, we haven't said that the S is supposed to move us backward here. So to accomplish this in here, because we don't have scales like we do in the normal inputs, we go to our modifier and say that this should be a negated value instead. So if we're pressing S and it's a full S input, so 1.0, then it will be returned as a -1, which allows us to have the same functionality as we have in the normal third-person character. So saving like this and going over here, we can now say that we want to add the mapping context that we have created, which is standard. So when we're starting to play, we're giving this character this mapping context, which allows it to listen to this input here. So starting up, playing, and now I can move right and left because that's the normal inputs, and forward and backwards you can see we get prints now. So you can see that This particular setup gets a lot of trigger events, and then when I let go, I get a completed event. This is because of our input action over here. So the default behavior will be triggers and completed for this specific one. However, we can add a different behavior here if we wanted to. We can have some triggers where we can define ourselves how we want to react. So the hold trigger, for example, will behave differently. So now if we go in and play, you can see that I'll get an ongoing event and a trigger event going on. So there will be an ongoing event until it reaches a certain hold length, and then it will do the trigger. So the different events here will be triggered in different circumstances based on the trigger that you have assigned to your input action. So if we were to have something that says tap, save, and we play, you can see that it only registers a bunch. I'm still holding the key down, which you of course can't see, but I am. So you only get a small section of ongoing events before it starts ignoring it, because it's supposed to be a tapping input action. So you have a different bunch of triggers you can have to configure how you want to react, what kind of events you want to have happen in conjunction with an input event, so that you can have it represent what kind of functionality you eventually want to have be driven by this input action. So anyway, trigger is going to be, if we remove these now, trigger is going to be the event that corresponds to normally getting a continuous event running when we're holding down a key. So now when we play, you can see I can move backwards and forwards. Actually, I can't move backwards. Let's see, did we not save? We have negate. I didn't put in our action value, like so. There we go. So forward and backward. So everything works as before, where the left and right is being controlled by normal inputs, forward and backward is being controlled by the enhanced input that we have set up currently. So let's add a jump input action as well now. So we go to input, input action, we can call this jump. Open that up. We want this to be an action mapping, so a digital, a true or a false. We can leave all the other settings there just fine. We want to add this to our mapping. So currently we just have a move forward. We want to add another one. And we say we want to have the jump one. We say we want to have it triggered when we press the spacebar. And that is essentially all that we need here. And now we can go to our third person character. We can go and first we can add our event. So we call IA jump. Then we go to our jump functionality and we steal these over here. And we put them next to our jump. Like so. So from triggered, we'll have our jump, and from completed, that will be when we release our key, essentially. We'll have stop jumping. And now we have our jumping being driven by our enhanced inputs. So let me just add the last input for moving right as well, and then I'll get back to you. And there we go. I have now added to our mapping context here the ability to move right with D and A, with A being a negative. And we now have the ability to run around just like before, but instead of using the normal inputs, we are making use of the enhanced inputs. Now that we have a basic understanding of how that works, let's look at some possible use cases for this. So one of the use cases this might be useful for is, for example, in games where you have tutorials, perhaps, where you feed the character abilities as the game progresses. Maybe to begin with it has very few abilities and then you grant them more and more. This is the example that I've created here. So we have this character, it has enhanced input to move around backwards, forwards, right, left, but the spacebar doesn't do anything. It has no functionality. In this little volume here next to me, I have an actor which grants a context. The context is jump, which has the input action to jump. So when I have moved into this volume like I did just now, I now have the ability to jump when I press the key. So let's take a look at that. So here we have the blueprint that corresponds to the volume that I just showed. It just has a simple begin overlap. It gets that character, it gets its controller, and then gets its enhanced input local player subsystem just so we can interact with it. And what we do is we're essentially saying we want to add a mapping context to it. And then this mapping context is just a exposed variable that we have on the actor. And then we destroy this actor. So essentially we're just adding a context. And how does this look? Well, instead of having everything in our standard like we had in the previous examples, I have created a context here which just has the jump in it. So adding this context allows the character to use spacebar to jump all of a sudden. And the standard that it starts off with is this, which only has the moving right and moving forward backward components or input actions available to it. So that's all it does. So that's one example where you could drip feed some functionality like jumping, and then you get the ability to use a weapon or something, and then you get the ability to dash or teleport or whatever it might be in your game. This would be one way that you can sort of segment off that type of functionality very easily without having to do any coding, essentially, except for just the parts where you apply context. Now let's take a look at a second condition that we might have, or a second use case. So let's say this is our character and we're running around and we get the ability to jump, all is good and fine, and then we get to a certain another position here, and let's say that when we run into this volume we enter climbing mode. So now our character immediately stopped here and I no longer can use my WASD to move around in the world. Also spacebar doesn't work anymore. If I press space it doesn't jump. What my WASD keys do now, however, is they climb. So if I press W, our character will, although not very gracefully, it will be moving upwards and downwards. So you can see that now I have a completely different context for what my controls do. So it's exactly the same controls as I had before, it's just that in a different context they produce different results. And that is another way that you can make use of these contexts in the enhanced input. So let's take a look at how this works. So for this situation I have created a context called climbing, and in this one I have named them differently so that it's very easy to see. So I have two axis mappings, one for up and down and one for right and left, and they're using the same keys as before. In the volume, which is being reused for this purpose as well, we're doing the exact same thing. If we're overlapping, we're getting our input local player subsystem, and then we're saying the following. We want to go into flying mode because that alleviates us having problems with gravity when we're climbing. We're stopping our movement immediately just to have it stop and not float around or something like that. Then we call on clear all mappings. This allows us to remove all the mappings that are currently active on the player, which allows us to then add only the mapping that we feel are of interest here, which is our climbing context in this case. And then we destroy the actor. So that's all that this does. It just removes all the mappings that we have before if we have multiples, and then we add the one that we want to have. So this is sort of the transition then when it comes to the character. And if we take a look at our character directly over here, we can see what this looks like. So here we have the functionality of moving right, moving backwards, forwards, and jumping. This is the normal stuff. And then we have the added inputs over here for climbing up and down. We're just doing something else. We're just moving our actor location without taking into consideration anything else. So that's all that there is to it here in this case. It's very easy. We can have same keys do different things depending on context. Now, these two use cases that I have shown so far are the ones that are most obvious to me. If you feel that there are any other use cases that are pretty obviously meant for this kind of functionality, feel free to drop them in the comments below. To end off, we're going to be looking at one more thing, which is, I have it here, bind test. So if we right click and go to our input, and you can see we have a player bindable input config. This input config allows you to map multiple mappings to it. So if we open this up, we can see that I have added here 2 different contexts that I want our character to have from the start. So I can say it should have the context for standard, which is moving forward and back, right and left, and it should have the jump ability to begin with. Then if I go to our character and I find our begin play, you can see I can get the, why do we have that one? We can get our enhanced local player subsystem again, like before, but instead of adding our standard context like we did before, we can instead choose to now use our mappable config instead, which is the bind test. This one will allow us to have all the mappings from beginning, meaning that we have the ability to run and jump without even having to go into the volume over there. So that's something you can do if you want to have a bunch of different, if you want to break out context in very small pieces and then have many of them grouped together for a certain situation where you want to not add mappings one by one, which you of course could if you wanted to as well. So that is all. I hope that this has given some better insight into how enhanced input works in Unreal Engine 5. Hopefully you found this video helpful. If you liked the video, leave a like. If you did not like it, leave a dislike. Leave any suggestions or comments you have down below. Subscribe and share this video if you want to see more like it in the future. That is all for now. Keep on learning. Take care.